3 words. That was all he said after the general finished speaking. 3 words delivered without hesitation, without apology, and without the slightest tremor of deference in his voice. The sergeant major, a man with 2 decades of Maroon Beret service behind him, a man who had tabbed across the Falklands in darkness carrying weight that would buckle most athletes, a man who had buried friends and continued fighting the same afternoon, looked across the planning table at 4 stars worth of NATO brass and said it plainly. This won't work. The room went quiet, not the polite quiet of men choosing their next words carefully. The absolute compressed silence of men who could not process what they had just heard. A senior non-commissioned officer in the British Parachute Regiment had just told a NATO general, in front of his own staff officers, intelligence officers, and Allied liaison teams, that the entire exercise concept he had spent months developing was operationally flawed. Not diplomatically flawed, not logistically challenging, operationally flawed. And he had said so without being asked. What happened in the minutes, hours, and days after that moment is a story the British Army doesn't advertise. It is a story about what happens when a military system spends decades building soldiers who are trained not simply to obey, but to think, to analyze, to tell the truth, regardless of the rank of the man sitting across the table. It is a story about a culture so deeply embedded in its people that it cannot be switched off at the door of a NATO briefing room. And it is a story about why the British Parachute Regiment, a force that has been in virtually continuous conflict since 1942, produces the specific kind of human being who looks at 4 stars on someone's shoulder and says, without blinking, that the plan will fail. To understand how that moment happened, you have to understand what the Parachute Regiment is, not what it does, what it actually is. The regiment was born from a crisis. In the summer of 1940, with Western Europe collapsing under the weight of German armor and Germany's airborne forces having seized Fort Eben-Emael in Belgium and dropped paratroopers across Norway and Holland with devastating effect, Winston Churchill issued a directive that would define British infantry for the next 8 decades. He wanted 5,000 parachute troops. He wanted them trained. He wanted them ready. What that directive created over the following 2 years was not simply a new infantry unit, it was a new philosophy of soldier. The men who answered the call to serve in the early parachute battalions understood from the first day of training that they were volunteering for a fundamentally different kind of war. The parachutist does not advance behind armor. He does not have artillery softening the ground ahead of him before he arrives. He does not have a logistics chain stretching back to a friendly rear area. He jumps from an aircraft into hostile territory with whatever he can carry on his body, lands in the dark, finds his comrades, consolidates whatever he can, and then holds his ground or seizes his objective against an enemy that almost invariably outnumbers him, is better supplied, and is fighting on ground it knows intimately. From that founding premise, everything about the Parachute Regiment's culture flows. Self-reliance is not a desirable quality in a paratrooper. It is the minimum requirement. A soldier who needs to wait for direction, who needs external validation before he acts, who cannot assess a situation independently and make a decision, is a soldier who will get his section killed the moment communications fail, and the company commander is 3 kilometers away dealing with his own problems in the dark. The British Army recognized this from the beginning, and so the selection and training system built to produce these soldiers was designed, from its earliest days, to identify and eliminate men who could not function without institutional support. What remains after that elimination process is something that the NATO general in that briefing room was about to discover he had fundamentally underestimated. Pegasus Company, known throughout the British military as P Company, is the pre-parachute selection organization of the British Armed Forces. Based at the Infantry Training Center in Catterick, North Yorkshire, it runs the selection courses that determine whether a soldier has the physical capacity, mental resilience, determination, and aggression to earn the right to wear the Maroon Beret of British Airborne Forces. The course culminates in Test Week, 8 events conducted under conditions of progressive fatigue, designed deliberately to strip away every psychological support the candidate has been relying on. The tests include a 10-mile loaded march that must be completed in under 1 hour and 45 minutes, carrying a Bergen rucksack and weapon. They include a stretcher race covering roughly 5 miles, with teams carrying a 175-pound stretcher loaded with equipment, rotating carries through terrain that destroys ankles and compresses spines. They include the log race, in which teams of 8 men carry a log weighing approximately 60 kilograms over an obstacle course, while instructors, the directing staff, press them for speed, cohesion, and aggression. They include the assault course, the steeplechase, and the Trenasium, a confidence obstacle structure built 30 feet above the ground, designed to identify candidates whose nerve fails at height, because a man who freezes on a beam 30 feet up will freeze in the door of a C-130 at 800 feet above a drop zone in enemy territory. And they include the milling, 1 minute of controlled hand-to-hand fighting with another candidate, no defense permitted, designed not to select the best fighter, but to identify the man who cannot maintain controlled aggression under direct physical threat. The man who covers up, who flinches, who shows the instructors that his instinct when struck is to protect himself rather than to attack, is failed. Not because the parachute regiment values aggression for its own sake, but because a man whose instinct is to shrink when the situation becomes dangerous is a man who will lead his section in the wrong direction at the exact moment that direction matters most. There are no adjusted standards for gender, background, or regimental history. The times are the times. The weights are the weights. The pass mark is the same for everyone. And the failure rate across decades of selection is significant. Many candidates who arrive physically capable of completing individual events fail the psychological dimension. They can carry the weight. They cannot carry the uncertainty of not knowing whether they are performing well enough, whether the next event will break them, whether the directing staff are recording failure or success on their clipboards. That uncertainty is not an accidental byproduct of the selection process. It is the product. It is what P Company is producing. A man who survives test week and earns the Maroon Beret has demonstrated one thing above all others. He can function under sustained stress when the outcome is unknown and the support structure has been deliberately removed. He does not need to be told he is doing well to keep going. He does not need visible evidence of progress to maintain his effort. He carries himself through the absence of certainty on nothing but his own determination. He has proven this not by saying so, not by performing well in interviews, but by doing it under conditions specifically designed to make him stop. That is the foundation. Everything the British Parachute Regiment builds on top of it rests on that single, proven truth about each of its soldiers. The Cold War was the crucible in which the Parachute Regiment's particular brand of institutional confidence was sharpened to its finest edge. Through the 1970s and 1980s, as NATO constructed the most elaborate peacetime military exercise program in history across West Germany, the regiment found itself playing a dual role that no other unit in the British Army occupied in quite the same way. On one hand, they were infantry. Elite infantry, certainly, but infantry nonetheless, subject to the same operational constraints, the same command hierarchies, the same planning processes as every other unit in the British Army of the Rhine. They attended the same NATO briefings. They received the same exercise directives. They sent their officers to the same staff colleges where the multinational planning doctrine was taught. On the other hand, they were airborne troops, and airborne troops in NATO's Cold War construct occupied a specific and uncomfortable space. The entire logic of NATO's defense plan for Western Europe, forward defense, the concept of holding a line as far east as possible along the West German border to prevent Soviet armor from overrunning the densely populated industrial heartland of the Ruhr, was built around mass, around armor, around the assumption that the decisive engagement would be a massive armored clash in the North German plain. It was built, in short, around everything the Parachute Regiment was not. Paratroopers are not a mass force. They are a precision force. Their entire doctrinal existence is predicated on being inserted at a specific point, at a specific moment, to achieve a specific effect that no other type of force can achieve by any other means. Drop them into a sustained attritional defense on a static line, and you are wasting the very quality that makes them worth having. Their strength is speed, surprise, violence of action, and the capacity to operate deep inside enemy territory without external support. None of those qualities are relevant to a static defensive line at the inner German border. This tension was not a secret. Senior British officers understood it. The regiment's commanding officers understood it. But in the planning cycles of large-scale NATO exercises, where staff officers counted brigades and divisions and armored regiments as fungible units to be moved across operational maps like pieces on a board, the specific and irreplaceable qualities of airborne troops were frequently reduced to a single box on an order of battle chart labeled Para-BDE and positioned accordingly. It was in this environment that the specific kind of confrontation described in the title of this story became not only possible, but, for those who know the regiment well, almost predictable. Exercise Lionheart, conducted from September to October 1984, was the largest British Army exercise since the Second World War. Over 131,565 NATO personnel took part, including British regular and territorial army soldiers, West German, Dutch, and American forces, operating across the exercise area in Lower Saxony. It took 4 years to plan and cost approximately £31 million at the time, equivalent to over £100 million today. Its purpose was to stress more thoroughly than any previous exercise the British Army's capacity to reinforce its core sector in West Germany and defend successfully against a Warsaw Pact offensive. It was the kind of exercise that generated enormous amounts of planning product. Staff officers at multiple echelons, from brigade to corps to Northag, the Northern Army Group NATO Command, produced operational orders, intelligence assessments, logistics plans, aviation schedules, and communications architecture that filled filing cabinets and occupied hundreds of man-hours of staff effort. At the highest levels of this planning apparatus sat general officers whose vision of the coming battle was shaped by doctrine, by strategic geography, and by the imperative of demonstrating NATO cohesion to both the Warsaw Pact and to the watching Allied governments that funded it. In the conferences that preceded exercises of this scale, the planning was presented, discussed, refined, and eventually approved. Allied liaison officers attended. Intelligence assessments were briefed. Operational concepts were walked through in detail. And at one such briefing, into a room filled with senior officers, Allied staff, and the accumulated institutional weight of a multinational headquarters, walked a British Parachute Regiment warrant officer, or senior NCO. A man who had done the maths in the way that men who have actually placed airborne troops on objectives in the dark know how to do them. He had read the concept. He had looked at the map. He had looked at the timings, the drop zones, the objectives assigned to the airborne element, the distances involved, the assembly plan, and the follow-on mission tasking. And he had identified something that the staff college-trained officers around that table had not weighted correctly. The gap between when the airborne element would be on the ground and when ground forces would reach them was not a planning inconvenience. It was a death sentence for the mission. He said so. 3 words. This won't work. What happened after those 3 words is where the story becomes something more than a moment of institutional friction. Because the man did not walk it back. He did not qualify his assessment with diplomatic softeners or strategic hedges. He elaborated. He walked through the calculation that he had already done in his head, the calculation that every officer in the room should have done and apparently had not done, or had done and not wanted to say out loud. The problem was not logistics, it was physics. The airborne element, inserted at the prescribed time using the available aircraft assets, would land at their drop zone with a specific consolidation timeline. They would need time to assemble under fire, collect their weapons containers, account for their personnel, establish communications, and begin movement to their objectives. That timeline was fixed by reality, not by planning preference. You cannot make paratroopers consolidate faster by writing a tighter plan. The bodies hit the ground, the containers are scattered across the drop zone, the men are disorientated from the aircraft exit and the landing, and the process of getting organized takes the time it takes, whether the plan allows for it or not. At the other end of the equation, the ground force relief timeline was based on assumptions about road movement rates, vehicle availability, fuel resupply, and the absence of enemy interference that even the most optimistic staff officer, if he were honest, would acknowledge were not guaranteed. In the scenario as planned, if those ground forces were delayed by even 45 minutes, the airborne element would be holding an objective with no resupply, limited ammunition, no armored support, and an enemy force that, in a realistic Warsaw Pact offensive scenario, would be attempting to retake that objective with everything it could bring to bear. 45 minutes was not an extreme variance. It was not a catastrophic planning failure. It was the kind of delay that happens routinely in military operations when vehicles break down, when roads are congested with retreating civilian traffic, when fuel deliveries are late, when a bridge that was supposed to be intact turns out not to be. 45 minutes was Tuesday. The para-sergeant major was not being dramatic. He was not being insubordinate in the sense of refusing a lawful order or undermining the authority of the command chain. He was doing something that the British military system had specifically built him to do. He was telling the truth about what he saw, based on knowledge that came from having actually placed airborne soldiers on objectives in the dark and understood at the most visceral level what consolidation looks like when it goes wrong. The general listened. Whether he wanted to or not, whether the institutional discomfort of having his plan challenged by a man with 3 stripes and a maroon beret created the kind of internal friction that generals feel when the hierarchy that normally protects their decisions is bypassed entirely, whatever was happening behind those 4 stars. He listened, because the math was the math. And the man presenting it was not going to sit down and pretend it was different because the room was uncomfortable. This moment did not happen in a vacuum. It happened inside a culture that had been producing exactly this kind of confrontation for 40 years. The Parachute Regiment's relationship with institutional authority has never been characterized by reflexive deference. From the regiment's earliest days, when the first airborne soldiers were volunteers drawn from every unit in the British Army and told that they could return to their parent units at any time if they chose not to continue, the fundamental contract between the regiment and its soldiers was different from the contract that existed in conventional infantry units. You are here because you chose to be. You are here because you passed selection. You are here because we have verified, through a process designed to strip away every pretense and every performance, that you can be trusted. And because you can be trusted, we will trust you with things that are not given to men who have not been tested in this way. That trust extends upward as well as downward. The Parachute Regiment expects its soldiers to tell commanding officers when plans are wrong, not after the fact, before, when there is still time to change them. The concept of the knowledgeable subordinate, the soldier at the coalface of an operation who sees something the man drawing the plan at brigade headquarters cannot see because he is not at the coalface. This is a concept the regiment has institutionalized to a degree that most military organizations have not. It is not insubordination. The distinction matters enormously. Insubordination is the refusal to follow a lawful order. What the para-sergeant major did in that briefing room was something entirely different. He was not refusing anything. He was not obstructing anything. He was providing professional input that he was specifically qualified to provide, based on experience that the general and his staff did not possess in the same form. And he was providing it directly, without the diplomatic softening that might have diluted the message enough for the people receiving it to feel comfortable ignoring it. The culture that produces this behavior did not arrive fully formed. It was earned. In Arnhem in 1944, when the 1st Airborne Division dropped into one of the most catastrophically planned operations of the Second World War, the men who survived 9 days of fighting vastly outnumbered German forces in a ruined Dutch city, did so because the individual soldier and small unit leader, cut off from higher command, unable to communicate with the broader force, unable to receive resupply or reinforcement, made decisions at the most local level that kept the fighting going. The battle was lost strategically, but it was fought with a tenacity and individual initiative that became the defining event in the regiment's institutional memory. The lesson Arnhem taught was not simply that airborne operations are dangerous. Every soldier already knew that. The lesson it taught was that when the plan stops working, and airborne plans stop working the moment the first man exits the aircraft, what matters is not the plan. What matters is the quality of the individual soldier, his capacity to assess the situation in front of him, make a decision with incomplete information, and execute that decision without waiting for permission that may never come. You cannot produce that quality in a soldier who has been trained to wait for orders. You cannot produce it in a man who has been conditioned by his selection and training to defer to institutional authority rather than to his own professional judgment. You produce it by selecting men who already have the seed of it and then cultivating it through years of training that rewards independent thinking, punishes passivity, and creates, in the words of one parachute regiment officer, soldiers who argue with you and are usually right. The Falklands in 1982 is the single most important operational reference point in the regiment's modern institutional memory, and it is relevant to this story for a reason that goes beyond the obvious demonstration of combat effectiveness. 2 Para and 3 Para deployed to the South Atlantic as part of 3 Commando Brigade in April 1982, facing conditions that would have tested any military force on Earth. They landed at San Carlos Water on 21st May, in the dark, in the rain, on a beach they had never seen, in a war that had been confirmed less than 6 weeks earlier, against an enemy holding prepared positions across terrain that offered almost no cover. They had no armor. They had limited artillery. They had no close air support that could be relied upon once the fleet's Harrier aircraft were committed to air defense. They had their feet, their weapons, and the weight they could carry on their backs. 2 Para's assault on Goose Green on 27th May 1982 is the example that proves the principle. The battalion attacked across open ground against a prepared enemy force in daylight, with no armor support and limited artillery. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel H. Jones, was killed. The plan, as originally conceived, did not survive contact. It rarely does. What survived contact was the quality of the soldiers executing it, their capacity to adapt in real time, to make local decisions without reference to higher command, to press forward when pressing forward was the only rational option. In the aftermath of the battle, 2 Para had taken its objective and secured over 1,200 Argentine prisoners. The margin of victory was not equipment superiority. It was the individual soldier's willingness to advance when every physical signal his body was sending said to stop. When every statistical analysis of the odds said that going forward was the wrong decision. When the plan was gone and there was nothing left but the training, the culture, and the knowledge, deep, personal, verified knowledge, that the man to your left and the man to your right would not stop moving. That knowledge is what a British Para-Sergeant Major carries into a NATO briefing room. It is what gives him the specific weight that allows him to say to a man with 4 stars on his shoulder that the plan is wrong, not insolently, not recklessly. With the measured precision of a professional who has stood where the plan breaks down, who has looked at the gap between what the order says and what the ground says, and who understands, with a clarity that no amount of staff college training can replicate, that the difference between those two things is measured in the lives of the men he is responsible for. He is not being difficult. He is being the soldier the regiment built him to be. The exercise proceeded. Exercises of this scale and cost, with this level of Allied participation and political investment, do not stop because a sergeant major raises an objection, however valid. The plan was modified in ways that the record does not make entirely clear. The timeline was adjusted, or the airborne tasking was reduced in ambition, or the ground force approach route was reconsidered. The specific changes are less important than the fact that changes were made, that the conversation happened at all, and that the man who started it walked out of the briefing room not facing a courts-martial, but facing his next day's work. This is the detail that matters most. In a different military, in a different culture, a sergeant major who told a general his plan would fail might have expected immediate and severe consequences. He might have expected to be removed from the exercise, returned to his unit under a cloud, formally censured, or simply frozen out of the planning process in a way that made clear that professional honesty of that kind would not be tolerated. None of those things happened. And the reason they didn't happen is not because the general was unusually enlightened or because the NATO command structure was in an unusually tolerant mood. It is because the British Parachute Regiment's institutional culture had already communicated, through decades of demonstrated operational effectiveness, that the opinions of its most experienced soldiers had been proven correct in conditions that mattered. When a para-sergeant major tells you your plan won't work, you have two choices. You can dismiss him on the grounds that he lacks sufficient rank to have an opinion that matters. Or you can remember Goose Green and Arnhem and every operation where a para-soldier's professional judgment, expressed without deference and often without being asked, had been the difference between a plan that succeeded and a disaster that didn't. The general, it appears, chose the second option, and the plan was adjusted. There is a broader point here that the moment in the briefing room illustrates with particular clarity. The NATO alliance at the height of the Cold War was managing an extraordinary collective defense challenge. Dozens of national armies, each with their own doctrine, their own training culture, their own institutional assumptions about how warfare worked, were attempting to construct a coherent defensive posture against an adversary that, by the mid-1980s, fielded over 50,000 tanks in Eastern Europe and could theoretically put 180 divisions in the field. The planning required to coordinate this effort was necessarily bureaucratic, necessarily institutional, and necessarily shaped by the need to produce documents that all the contributing nations could agree on, sign, and file. It was shaped, inevitably, by the compromises that multinational planning always requires. And in that environment, the specific, practical, ground-level knowledge of what airborne operations actually look like, what consolidation timelines actually are, what happens to a para-battalion holding an objective without relief, was exactly the kind of knowledge that most easily gets lost in the translation from tactical reality to operational plan. The sergeant major who stood up in that room and said those three words was not challenging the concept of collective defense. He was not questioning the legitimacy of the alliance or the value of the exercise. He was performing the most essential function that any military institution can perform, and the function that bureaucratic planning processes most consistently fail to preserve. He was injecting the truth of what the ground looks like at the moment when the plan meets it, into a conversation that was in danger of proceeding without it. That function, the provision of ground truth by those who have actually stood on the ground, is what the Parachute Regiment's training and selection system is ultimately designed to produce. Not just physical capability, not just aggression, the confidence and the competence to walk into any room, regardless of the rank of the people in it, and say clearly what needs to be said. To provide the professional input that only experience can generate, without the softening, the hedging, and the strategic ambiguity that institutional hierarchy so often imposes on the information that most needs to be heard unfiltered. P Company's Test Week events are described in verified British Army documentation. They include the mile-and-a-half squad run, the assault course, the steeplechase, the log race, the 2-mile stretcher race, the trainasium, the 10-mile loaded march, and the milling. Each event has pass and fail standards. Each is conducted under fatigue, with the previous event's physical cost still resident in the candidates' bodies. There are no second chances within test week. A candidate who fails a single event is removed. The pass rate varies year to year, but the course consistently eliminates a significant proportion of its intake. The 10-mile loaded march is completed carrying a burden of approximately 35 pounds plus weapon and equipment. The time limit, which has been publicly reported at under 1 hour and 45 minutes, is fixed. The terrain is whatever the North Yorkshire training area delivers. The weather is whatever December in North Yorkshire delivers. Candidates who have trained specifically for this event, who have built to this exact load over months of preparation, who arrive in the best physical condition of their lives, still fail it in meaningful numbers. Not because the physical requirement is impossible. Because P Company is not testing physical fitness. It is testing the quality of the mind behind the body when the body wants to stop. The trainasium requires candidates to perform actions at height, including a shuffle bars traverse across a beam 30 feet above the ground and a forward fall from a platform. There is nothing physically difficult about shuffling sideways across a beam. Virtually any person with moderate physical coordination can do it at ground level. At 30 feet, with no safety net in the early iterations of the course, the neurological reality of height intervenes. Men who have demonstrated superb physical fitness in every other event freeze on the trainasium. They cannot make their legs move. Their body, convinced by the height that movement equals death, refuses the instruction from their brain. These men are removed, not because they are cowards, but because a man who cannot override his survival instinct at height will not step out of an aircraft door, will not advance under fire, will not hold a position that every instinct tells him is going to kill him. The milling is 1 minute in duration. Both candidates are instructed to punch forward continuously. Defense is not permitted. Covering up, clinching, and retreating are all markers of failure. The purpose, as the British Army's own documentation acknowledges, is to test controlled aggression under direct physical threat. The man who absorbs a punch and attacks in response, who maintains his forward intention when the most direct physical signal in human experience, being struck in the face, is telling him to stop and protect himself, is demonstrating the quality that will allow him, years later, to advance into an Argentine defensive position at Goose Green when the man beside him has just been killed. These 8 tests produce the Maroon Beret, and the Maroon Beret, over the course of a career in the Parachute Regiment, is the foundation on which everything else is built. The operational tours, the accumulated experience, the specific knowledge that comes from conducting operations in Northern Ireland, in the Falklands, in the Balkans, in Sierra Leone, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. The knowledge that comes from having planned operations that didn't work and had to be remade in contact, from having held positions against forces that should have overrun them, from having been the man at the far end of the radio when the person at the other end is asking for something you cannot give them, and knowing with absolute certainty that the problem is going to be solved without it. The sergeant major who spoke in that briefing room had that knowledge. It sat in his body in a way that the planning documents on the table did not reflect and could not contain. It had been built through years of training, years of operational experience, and a series of verified personal confrontations with the thing that every military plan ultimately has to face: the ground, the enemy, the dark, and the gap between what the order says and what the situation is. He was not the first parachute regiment soldier to provide unwelcome professional input to a senior officer. He will not be the last. The regiment produces these moments not because its soldiers are difficult or disrespectful, but because it specifically selects for and trains the quality that makes them possible. It selects men who can function without external validation. It trains them in institutions that reward professional honesty and punish passivity. It puts them in operations where the cost of saying something that needs to be said and not saying it can be counted in bodies. By the time a para-sergeant major walks into a NATO planning conference, he has been assessed multiple times at multiple levels and found to be a man whose professional judgment can be trusted with information that matters. The institutional culture that surrounds him does not tell him to be quiet when a general is speaking. It tells him to speak when he has something professional and valid to say. He had something professional and valid to say. He said it. The exercise went ahead. The NATO alliance continued its work. The plan was adjusted in ways that the public record does not fully describe, because exercises at this level of sensitivity are not debriefed in public documents. The sergeant major returned to his unit and continued doing what para-sergeant majors do: preparing soldiers, evaluating plans, going on operations when operations were called for, burying friends when the operations went wrong in the ways that operations sometimes go wrong. What remained after the exercise in the memory of the Allied officers who were in that room was the specific quality of the moment, not the confrontation itself, which was over in seconds. But what it represented: a military culture so confident in the professional competence of its own people at every level of the hierarchy that a sergeant major could challenge a general's plan in a room full of Allied officers and walk out still wearing his beret. A system so thoroughly committed to operational honesty that the social discomfort of the moment was judged by everyone present, including the general, to be less important than the truth the man had delivered. That is not a universal quality in military institutions. It is not common. It is the product of a specific, long, and deliberately constructed process that begins at P Company in Catterick, continues through operational tours in some of the most demanding environments on Earth, and culminates in the specific kind of soldier who knows, not believes, not hopes, but knows that when he says something is true, it is because he has verified it in conditions that do not permit self-deception. The British Army has a phrase for this quality. It does not appear in doctrine. It is not written in the Parachute Regiment's formal history. It exists as a cultural artifact passed from RSM to company sergeant major to platoon sergeant across generations of service. The phrase is simply this: tell them what they need to hear, not what they want to hear, what they need to hear. The sergeant major told the general what he needed to hear. The general, to his considerable credit, heard it. The plan was adjusted. The exercise proceeded, and somewhere in the files of a NATO headquarters, in an after-action report that will likely remain classified for decades, there is a notation, possibly no more than a line or two, describing a moment when a para-soldier with 3 stripes and a maroon beret and 20 years of the hardest military service Britain has produced walked into a room, looked at a plan, and said the thing that needed to be said. It did not require courage in the sense that Goose Green required courage, or Arnhem, or the night attacks across the Falkland Hills in darkness and freezing wind. It required something that, in its own way, is equally rare and equally the product of the same long, deliberate process of selection and testing. It required a man who knew what he knew and was not willing to pretend otherwise just because someone with more stars on their shoulder was in the room. That is what the Parachute Regiment builds. That is what P Company selects for. That is what 40 years of continuous operations in every corner of the world has refined into the specific kind of soldier who makes NATO generals sit in silence for a moment before they ask their next question. Take your rank and go home. The para was not saying it to the general. He was saying it to every assumption in the room that expertise flows downward from rank and upward from experience. The man with the maroon beret had the experience. He spoke, and the room listened.